When we talk about women in history, we tend to prefer to talk about the women who stood out from the crowd. But I think that the women in the crowd also deserve some attention. Hello! It's time for the last part in the series about the pre-industrialized housewife. Today we're going to talk about food. A huge part of the housewife's life was to see to it that the people of the farm didn't starve throughout the year. As I've said earlier, the pre-industrialized life was more or less self-sufficient. There were no shops for people to buy their food from, well, for most people at least, and they just had to do with whatever they could get and whatever they could store. The storaging of the food was quite a difficult matter, and the housewife had to know how the different kinds of food were best preserved and stored, and also when it was the best time to eat different things. There were different ways of preserving different kinds of food. What we can keep in mind is that, simply put, for an item to rot, it needs three different things. It needs air, it needs water, and it needs some kind of microorganism that eats and lives on the food. And there are different ways of tackling these three parts of the rotting process, because if one is missing, the rotting can't be there. Let's just start with the air. Today we prevent the air to get to our food by vacuum packing, and of course that wasn't really possible historically, but they could store things in fat, or even water could prevent the air to get to the food. As number two, we have the water, and that's quite obvious, isn't it? We just remove the water by drying things. So dried meat and dried vegetables and things like that. And this is the oldest way of preserving food, actually. And then there's the third part, the microorganisms. To have something rotting, there has to be microorganisms settling on the food and also multiplying. You can prevent the multiplying by using different kinds of chemicals. Most commonly used are salt and sugar, but also smoke is really useful for this. You can kill off most of these microorganisms by heating or freezing the food, or you can let the microorganisms live and multiply on the food, but in a matter that you decide. That's what we do with cheese, for instance. We let them mold, but just enough for us to still be able to eat it, and often the food gets better from it. But even though the housewife probably didn't know why these methods worked, she knew that they worked, and she used them as good as she could. So, what did her year look like then, food-wise? Let's start in summertime. And this is the most boring part of the year for the farmers, since their storages were running quite empty at this time. And it still was quite long before it was time to harvest. The lack of food in the summertime could be quite a problem, actually, since the work they had to do at this time of the year was so much harder than it was in other times of the year. In summertime, they had to rely on foods that could be stored for a very long time, like cheese or dried meats, or, as always, all around the year, porridge. But the accomplished housewife knew how to forage the nature around her. Things like nettles and ground elder were really welcome fresh foods in the early summer. And then, probably in September or so, it was time for the harvest. And the autumn also was the time for the slaughtering of the farm's animals. This was a time of plenties, but of course they couldn't just start binging. They had to take care of and store everything immediately. And this was one time for the housewife's organizational skills to go to work. Immediately after the slaughter, they had to start eating the things that couldn't be preserved. So usually the first days were for taking care of the blood. They could make black pudding or blood pancakes. Here in northern Sweden they baked blood bread, and they made something called palt, and that's kind of a dumpling with blood in it. After the blood, it was time to eat the animal's offals, and that's some of the animal's internal organs. The liver, the kidney and the lungs, for instance. And when those have been eaten, we are probably closing in on Christmas. Then it was time to eat the things that could be preserved for a short time. For Christmas, there could be tongue, pig's trotters, and entire heads. As you can see, there still haven't been any big, meaty parts eaten. That's because these parts can be stored for a long time. So, the Christmas ham that we eat in Sweden is not a very old tradition. The ham should probably be better for Easter, perhaps. At the time for the slaughter, nothing was wasted. The animal's hide was taken care of to be tanned and used as leather. The hoofs could be boiled to produce a really fine oil, or they could make glue from them. And all the little meaty scraps and bits were made into sausages, of course with the animal's intestines as sausage casings. Moving on to fish. Fish was eaten all throughout the year. Usually the farmers bought barrels full of salted fish, and it was seen more or less as staple food. Freshwater fish was fished whenever anyone had the time to do it. And my guess is that freshwater fishing have saved a lot of lives among the poor people. The biggest harvest was the cereal crops. And again, what could be grown depended very much on where they were. To be able to grow wheat and have that to be ready for harvest, you will have to sow it in March, perhaps. Rye and oats are a bit faster, but the fastest of them all is the barley. This is barley, hanging to dry. In most places they mostly use it to make beer or for animal fodder, but here in northern Sweden we make crisp bread from it. The traditions of baking have been very different in different parts of the world. In France and England and in many other places they baked on a regular basis, maybe even daily. And most of the time that was soft bread of different qualities. Here, where the barley is the only cereal crop that could be grown, they didn't have much of a choice. But the thing is that it's not possible to make a really good soft bread from barley. It doesn't ferment very well. That's one of the reasons why people chose to make crisp bread. Another reason was that crisp bread kept for much longer, so they didn't have to bake as often. Most people only baked twice a year, but then they did it for days. The last part of this video is about the dairy products. And we have so many different cultures when it comes to what we can make from milk. For some, it was more of a complement to the staple food, which was usually bread. And for some people, it was more or less staple food. Milk is a very good way of getting good fats and proteins into your diet, but the problem is that milk doesn't hold very well. But if you can make cheese or butter from it, it can be stored for ages. Well, the butter will go rancid after a couple of months. But there are even stories about people in history that preferred the rancid butter. They thought that the fresh butter wasn't ready to eat yet. We also still eat sour cream, sour milk and yogurt. Nowadays we keep a close control over the making of these foods. But in history they just had a couple of barrels where they kept their sour milk product. And then they just filled it up when it got empty, and that way they kept the same bacterial culture alive for years and years and years. The housewife of the pre-industrialized era had to be a master organizer. If she wasn't, her entire family would starve. This ends my series on the pre-industrialized housewife, but I'm sure we will come back and visit her in later videos. Next week there will be more talk about food, my favorite subject. I hope you learned something new today. See you soon, I hope. Bye!